The election campaign that we've just all experienced was the journalistic gift that keeps on giving. And I'd intended to draft these remarks once the result was known. But recognising that I was speaking at the Writers Festival, not Improv Night at the Comedy Festival, I couldn't wait for the white smoke. So I've had to wade on in. And I want to talk about tonight's topic in the context of the election campaign we've just been through and the debate that has emerged around journalistic coverage of that campaign. Because this election has changed how we think about politics as usual in this country, and it's also triggered significant debate about the practice of political reporting. And I want to go right in and wade into these muddy waters and make some muddied observations about the campaign and how it was handled by the Fourth Estate, and then make some tentative suggestions about the implications for the media and the nature of news coverage. And then, following the proud tradition of these events, it'll be time for questions where you can tear into me. The toughest Senate estimate sessions are mere training for encounters like this. I want to break with the curmudgeons who talked about a boring election campaign, saved only by a thrilling election night and the epic drama that followed. The long-standing, predictable narrative train of this election, predestined when the government soared 20 points ahead in the polls, was derailed in the dead of a Canberra's winter's night. And now, for the first time since 1993, we had two new leaders in the top jobs fighting their first election. The most inexperienced Prime Minister to ever face an election. A dangerously honest opposition leader with, to use Annabel Crabb's memorable phrase, a truth parrot squawking on his shoulder. Polls in flux, strategies in disarray, an electorate polarised, idiosyncratic, unpredictable. And important matters in play: the economy, the environment, national infrastructure, a nation at war. Rare ingredients for journalists and journalism, a remarkable opportunity to use old tools and new tools to bring the story to the Australian people. A few days into the campaign, the ABC launched its long-awaited 24-hour news channel. While Sky had been on air for 15 years and has increasingly focused on live events and coverage from Canberra, with ABC News 24, we created a news channel that was an option for all Australian homes, not just the 30% with pay TV. The mixed model of public and commercial news services has served Australia well for 60 years and will serve us well in the era of 24-hour television news as well. Competition, despite the protestations of monopolists, has been to the advantage of both audiences and practitioners. Sky, for example, greeted our arrival by winning more money from its owners and putting that to good use. They had a strong campaign, as did ABC News 24. Modern campaigns, it strikes me, are the political version of the Truman Show. Keep the channel on and you know what I mean. He's on a bike. She's on a train. He's running with kids. She's eating a cake. He's making a speech. She's holding a doorstop. He looks cranky. She looks tired. Where is he now? Why is she wearing that hat? She drinks Guinness. He drinks shandies. If he'd done it in week 2 rather than on the final day of the campaign, Abbott's liking for a shandy made with light beer could have killed him in those Western Sydney marginals. Campaigns have always had these features, but now everyone can see it. Outsiders become insiders. And now we have the truncated news cycle, which advances stories and then responds to them and then creates further iterations through the day. Previously, campaigns were all about setting up the evening news and providing stories for tomorrow's newspapers. But now, with this news cycle, there's far more. The news cycle exacerbates the phenomenon. The politicians always seem to be on. And now we can all see what once only the journos saw. The politicians are scripted, They do the same things over and over again because less variation in response means fewer choices for journalists to report on something you don't want them to report on. The old maxims applied and taught to politicians apply now more than ever before. They're taught just when you're sick of saying it, people are beginning to hear it for the first time. Don't answer the question they ask, answer the question you wanted them to ask. Don't change the argument, change the audience. These are the rules politicians have been long taught, and they apply more than ever in the era of 24-hour news. And the journalists are shunted and controlled and frustrated, and increasingly, as the days go by, sick and tired. It might be more controlled, there might be more events, things might be more closely scripted, but this is modern campaigning. It's just that we can see it now live around the clock. Every press conference, every speech, every photo op, and in the background, every nodding local candidate. It might be refined, but it is not new. There have long been books written about this stuff, pioneered by Teddy White with his epic The Making of the President, 1960. But now we can all see how political campaigning is done, and like seeing how the law and sausages are made, it's not always an edifying experience. But I would argue it is important. The scrutiny, the performance under pressure, the way questions are answered and avoided, the way unexpected events are dealt with, managing the tiredness, the frustration, the disappointments. This is part of the political crucible our leaders must endure. Attention must be paid to this. There needs to be a bus. Journalists need to be on it. Asking questions, waiting for the unexpected, watching it all and reporting back. This was, after all, one of the great achievements of Tony Abbott in the campaign. The most mercurial of performers, disastrous in 2007, prone to erratic bursts, turning in such a disciplined performance. After a shaky start, he reminded me of a marathon runner clocking 5-minute miles, mile after mile. The consistency allowed people the opportunity to rethink him and what he might offer. Just as the lack of consistency from the Prime Minister, the articulated shift from the programmed to the real, caused people to rethink their view of her also. Another great political classic of the past was The Boys on the Bus by Timothy Krause, about the journalists covering the 1972 presidential campaign. Well, now we know all about the 2010 bus. Journalists tweeting their frustrations, snap commentaries, collective fury, live crosses back and forth to the news channels, to local radio, the journalists adding to the colour of the campaign. But off the bus, senior journalists sit back and read and watch and review and dig and come to judgment. The field of reference is so limited on the bus. You don't just want journalists there. On the bus, it's hard to see the broader field, and so that's why so many of the big guns don't get on board. What was significant in this campaign was how senior journalists would break stories, good old-fashioned scoops, that would set up the agenda for reporters to follow on the bus, a different one than the parties often wanted the journalists on the bus to write about. Think of the examples. Chris Ullman on the first night of ABC News 24, breaking the story about the young political staffer who used to sit in for the Prime Minister at the top-level defence meetings. Lenore Taylor's scoop on the Treasury costings of the Coalition's proposal. Laurie Oakes on the Prime Minister's reluctance to embrace parental leave. Philip Adams at 10 o'clock at night on Radio National, getting the former Prime Minister to break his silence. Stories that dominated every press conference in the days after. Reporters on the road following up the lead that every editor wanted to advance. And while there's been some discussion over whether there was an over-fixation on these issues, I would simply argue that at any time, during any campaign, there are great scoops that are delivered the way that any great journalist delivers a scoop. Authoritatively, mysteriously. a reflection of experience, credibility and contacts cultivated for just this moment. I'll come back to the policy discussion shortly, but I want to add that this campaign did feature great substantive journalism and genuine investigative energy. Full hours of radio were devoted on Radio National's background briefing, presciently to the crisis in rural Australia, and also a program on the National Broadband Network. There was a stunning undercover investigative piece on Four Corners about people smuggling, and then again a compelling case study on mental health issues based in a regional city. The detailed stuff was there, often where we've found it in the past, particularly in long-form news and current affairs. And it's not as though policies in this campaign weren't debated at the Press Club and elsewhere, where ministers and their shadows, senior campaign spokesmen and candidates had the opportunity to engage around policy differences. And as has been the case for nearly 15 years now, any candidate who seeks the top office had to endure cross-examination from Kerry O'Brien. This time, 3 interviews for each of the leaders, moments when the whole campaign seemed to come to a halt while the questions were placed and answered, and then afterwards, an assessment of the impact. This campaign offered a depth and richness through online coverage that was never previously available. Certainly not at the ABC. And we've never had the chance to offer as many different perspectives, as many different policy and political insights as we were able to through our website, The Drum. One of the joys about online is that you have space to run detail on every candidate in every seat on Anthony Green's election pages. Pendulums and calculators and demographic analysis, detailed policy briefings, press conferences available in full, debates, archival material, all there for anyone who is interested, for anyone who wants it. I remember being delighted when Annabelle Crabb wrote a story for The Drum trying to explain what it was like to follow the candidates on the bus. And the storm had erupted about the behaviour of the journalists following the politicians. She wrote the piece, and in it noted her surprised realisation that she'd already passed the 2,500 word mark. 2,500 words, virtually an impossibility for a weekday turnaround piece in a newspaper. More than half the words in a 30-minute news bulletin, but the space is there online to tell the story properly. I do think one of the great achievements of this campaign was the deconstruction of the political process for all to see. Look at Gruen Nation. Remarkable audiences being educated about the dark arts of political communication, the construction of crafted messages, the execution of the smear, the dog whistle, the earworm jingle. We laughed and we learned, and by the last week of the campaign, when the advertising barrage was remorseless, we were all the wiser. But interestingly, I think all these features, culminating in the most comprehensive and exhausting campaign coverage ever, do not capture its most salient aspect: the voices of the public being heard more than ever before. The first example is through blogs and the Twitter traffic. Halfway through the campaign, the ABC executive met on a Monday morning and discussed the weekend blog that had been written by the Canberra public servant, writing under the tag Grog's Gamut. He wrote a lacerating critique of journalists following the candidates, their obsession with transient matters, the political scandal of the day. He met a chorus of praise and support, triggering a barrage of criticism of campaign coverage. I do think there's quite a bit of beard stroking on this issue. There will be big political stories, and they often have important implications, like how united or divided a party is, or how seriously they treat matters of national security. Leaders must be questioned on these issues. And often it is hard to ask nuanced questions about policy that is only being delivered in press release form in your hands at the beginning of a press conference, if at all. In fact, often the leaders only want you to ask questions on their policy, on their day, on their terms, without allowing you to dig, avoiding the news stories and deflecting other issues for another occasion. I believe you need both. You need the journalists on the bus firing the questions, you need the team back at headquarters doing the digging, taking paths away from the mainstream, so that we don't just get more and more about less and less. One of the questions of this campaign is whether we took advantage of the increased capacity to create and deliver content using digital media to provide the breadth and depth of coverage that was possible. And if we did, whether we really helped interested voters to find it. There has been some criticism of journalists treating the election as a horse race and treating every poll, every press conference, every wrinkle on a story as a chance to slash odds, fine-tune predictions and call the result. It reminds me of when I was a newspaper executive and I met Spiro Zavos, the Sydney Morning Herald's famed rugby analyst, outside the final of the 2003 World Cup. And I asked the question you always ask the expert. I asked, who's going to win? And he said to me, I don't know, Mark, that's why they're playing the game. We don't only want horse race journalism, but the result matters, as does the path that was taken to get there. Polls may only be a snapshot in time, a theoretical moment on the way to a real outcome. But polls and campaign ups and downs do have an impact. Tactics change, new policies emerge, old policies are dead, buried, cremated because of the polls. Polls cost a Prime Minister his job this year. And the race isn't only held on election day. It is held day in, day out through the campaign and in the lead up to the final voting and counting. Like the Tour de France, the final sprint into Paris is not where the race is usually won. It is a multi-week epic, slogging through the hills and the middle stages, going day after day. And the person who emerges from those hills, those mountains, wearing the yellow jersey towards the end, usually takes the prize. Now, appreciate that this parallel might break down if you're trying to compare the views across the French countryside to the views inside Rooty Hill RSL, but you understand what I mean. At the ABC, we did identify during the campaign that the dynamic political news was crowding out proper reporting of policy initiatives in some news bulletins, and that we needed to allocate more time to reporting some of the issues properly. We adjusted our strategy as we listened to the critics, our audience, and critiqued our own coverage. Politics and policy are not binary choices. We need to do both. The contribution of bloggers, the constant feedback and commentary of thousands through the AusVote stream on Twitter were watched and considered by every mainstream media editor. And as we could see, the impact made by some bloggers was every bit as great as that made by other mainstream professional journalists. And through Twitter, the people formerly known as the audience, to use Jay Rosen's phrase, could become real participants, firing in questions, challenging journalists, finding facts and delivering them to those on the road. Part of the conversation, not simply observers. As Groggs Gammett wrote last week for The Drum, Twitter and the massive amateur blogs contain many smart people who, for some bizarre reason, enjoy writing about policy. The media should not scorn these people. They should feed off them for ideas and research, properly acknowledged, of course. The blogosphere is no place for the faint-hearted. You know that by reading comments on stories, and they're the ones that often get through the moderation process. But there's no filter on Twitter. And I expect there will now always be savagery in the criticism of much mainstream media performance, just as most weeks there's robust criticism of the professionals who run out into the sporting fields or those who get elected to office. What is important, though, is to find the signal through the noise. that there was some significance in the signal could be heard from those writing and commenting on the campaign over the 5 weeks. And of course, we had clearly demonstrated in the campaign that the people formerly known as the audience know how to ask good questions. Questions that were funny, full of emotion, questions fueled by rage or fear, questions full of uncertainty or full of contempt. The audiences flocked to Q&A to see the leaders questioned by real people. The crowds at Rooty Hill and the Broncos showed to many in the media cocoon precisely the issues that drove people to make the decisions they made on polling day. And by getting out to find the voters' voice through a range of people, we got a sense of what was really going on. And I thought the work of the AM team, crisscrossing the country, talking to people in their homes and at their work, helped us all understand the country a little better. Much of AM's time was spent in regional areas, and during the campaign the program addressed issues the whole country was to hear much more of once the empowered independent members of Parliament strode in from the bush and grabbed the nation's attention. It was quite a campaign. Some of the criticism I understand. We would have all liked more detailed policy engagement by the candidates, have them a little less scripted, offering more unguarded moments of honest engagement around complex substantive issues. Some issues were underreported. Some important questions were not asked. Some were not answered. And I'm not going to defend every interview or every press conference. But having come from print into broadcasting, can I just say there is nothing tougher than a live interview. No second takes, no rewrites, no sub-editors, no time for reflection or collaborative discussion, just the moment and what you can make of it, given what is being presented to you from across the table. Journalists can only deal with what they have, and there were 2 main candidates marching to a plan, trying hard not to deflect from it. We still need to do better in reporting the campaign and the politics, while simply not dancing to a tune set by party strategists or the pressing story of the moment. What do we learn from all this? What does it all mean for journalism and our quest for truth, and are there implications for the ABC? A challenge for media organisations is to think about what is compelling in this era of global content, of endless archives and long tails, of generic content and time shifting and the breakdown of appointment viewing. One of the things I think we learned from this campaign is that in this era, live matters. Events matter. Sport, the final of MasterChef, news. In this election, news audiences were huge. On ABC News 24, they were immediately much larger than we had envisaged. There were enormous numbers for Gruen and Chaser, the 7 p.m. news, and in 7:30 Report land. When Tony Abbott appeared on Q&A, there were 35,000 separate tweets sent to the program during 1 hour. This election was a compelling media product, and that is good news for journalism. When the story matters, the news counts. Now, there are challenges with how you deal with that as a media organisation. How do you cut through when everyone's covering the same story? Well, enter Mark Latham. I look at Channel 9 with amazement. A reported $10,000 payment for Latham, $1 million publicity, reasonable ratings, and Laurie Oakes enhances his reputation on the same network by attacking it all as a farce. Now that's showbiz. What isn't so good is how everyone else gave the stunt so much oxygen. The Taylor and Oakes and Ullman leaks were real news. Latham was the ultimate pseudo-event, and the way every news outlet gave it oxygen was a low point. And there's also evidence, I think, through this campaign that money is not all that matters. The election night ratings were interesting in this respect. The expertise of the ABC, our investment in research and experience over time, attracted a much larger audience than the vast extravaganzas on election night on commercial networks. The audience can tell the difference between news and showbiz, and they want each in due season. I read the speeches of Kim Williams, the CEO of Foxtel, and John Hartigan, the CEO of News Limited, that they gave at the Pampa Newspaper Industry Conference last week with interest. Both spoke with great enthusiasm about the opportunities of new technology for journalism, and there is much in which they say that I'm in heated agreement. But checking my bulletproof vest for a minute, I'd like to make one observation about what a current trend might mean for future campaigning and journalism. I'm acutely aware of the pressures faced by commercial media organisations, particularly newspapers, in their pursuit of a viable business model. And I've always maintained that some media companies can and will be able to devise strategies to deliver targeted, value-added material for audiences that are willing to pay for it. A diminution of competition is simply not in the public interest. Australia's media mix has worked for more than 60 years, the public and the private together, and we still need that diversity in the digital age. But what this election has clearly highlighted and foreshadowed is that some of the proposed charging models bring with them very big risks. Tony Abbott's words on the live Rooty Hill debate were interesting. He said he thought it was a great event. He was just sorry that so few people saw it. The ratings showed that fewer than 100,000 people watched the Rooty Hill event, compared to more than 3 million people who watched the leaders' debate. And this is, of course, because it was held behind a paywall. It was designed for a pay TV audience, and it was structured with hours to fill in their schedule. And Sky argued at the time that it was a television program, not a news event, and denied anyone else live access. Reacting to criticism, the organisers of the identical format in Brisbane a few days later suddenly decreed that it was a news event, not a television program, and made it available to all. But the lesson was obvious. A paywall slashes your potential audience. And I think we can really see the signs of this now in the field of print. I think that Laura Tingle, the chief political writer for the Australian Financial Review, is probably this country's finest writer when it comes to sophisticated political analysis. But I would argue that far from dominating the conversation, too often Laura's fine words and analysis disappear from view, locked up behind the Fin's expensive and impenetrable paywalls. This is a classic example of what's been described as the link economy at work. The value that comes in the online world from links that allow your story, allow your content to be spread throughout the community. And through its dissemination, the work garners comments and power, and at the end is more highly prized. Unfortunately, with Laura Tingle, unless you're one of the 75,000 who buy the paper or pay very significant amounts for an online subscription, much of the potential audience of her work misses out. There are no links from her work because it's not available online. No tweets, few comments, little blogging response, no email, no online references. And as a result, the presence and impact of the work is starkly reduced. I know the arguments about content needing a price and audience needing to pay. I don't dispute this. I'm simply saying that if your model means you're putting your best content and hiding it away rather than spreading it around wisely, then you run the risk of removing yourself from the conversation at a time when the media is all about the conversation. Setting an agenda, driving a response, engaging with your audience leads you to the pay model that showcases your best talent and drives the habit of readership rather than locking your talent away. If the miracle happens and the emergent government goes full terms, it remains to be seen what will happen at the next election. What happens if the Australian locks its content behind a paywall, or the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age? Will the impact of these newspapers and these journalists diminish? Will the conversation go on without them? These are things we don't know, but they're things worth debating. For the moment, though, there's still life in newspapers, and an enraged or crusading newspaper editor can still attract a politician's attention. But what if in the future your journalism is not available to be widely shared and talked about? Will the politicians still pay attention? Let me tell you a story that hasn't been revealed through the campaign. Within half an hour of Tony Abbott saying on Insiders that he wanted another town hall meeting in Brisbane, the ABC started talking with the parties, booking a hall, collecting an audience. Our real focus and conversation was about arranging a final debate late in the last week of the campaign, and we were happy to have a town hall meeting as part of it. In my discussions with the campaign directors, it was clear to me that they wanted this event to be on free-to-air television so it could be seen by as many people as possible, and they were very happy to use ABC talent to host it. But finally, there was no way that either party was going to upset a monopoly Murdoch newspaper in the pivotal swing seat of Queensland 3 days before polling day. The thought of what the Courier Mail would do to the candidate, who didn't show to the event that the Courier Mail was sponsoring, was chilling to contemplate. The Prime Minister got a taste anyway from the treatment of the Daily Telegraph on election eve. So faced with the power of the Courier Mail, we stepped back. But it did say to me conclusively that the system of debates and town hall meetings should not be in the hands of political parties nor media organisations. The events for debates and town hall meetings, the venues, the panels, the hosts, should be set by a totally independent panel and commonly understood a year before the election date. I agree with John Hartigan's assessment that newspapers need to evolve to deliver news 24 hours a day to audiences in print and on a range of devices. And this has been the key to our thinking at the ABC, and it's led to 1 million iPhone apps now being downloaded of ABC content, 100,000 iPad apps where people can look at the best of our website, the latest news, and live streaming News 24. I tentatively suggest that what we saw in this campaign was also a new style of journalism where journalists increasingly showed skills they hadn't shown before. Laurie Oakes is masterful on Twitter. Chris Ullman is a wonderful writer. Fran Kelly, terrific on television. And these cross-platform appearances reinforce brands, cross-promotes, build skills, all positive things for journalists and journalism. Let me conclude by talking about two things that we may do in the future. The ABC hosted the American academic Jay Rosen during the campaign, and he's always good value. And he had two suggestions for the ABC, which we're exploring and will most likely to pursue. The first thing he said that we should do is provide more background, more detail, more context for our audience who are coming afresh to complex stories like the ETS or the NBN. He said the ABC has a role as a patient explainer of these complexities, to help people catch up with the conversation, to understand what is being said, and to make a contribution if they wish. And we think this plays nicely to our charter role to provide an educational service to the community. And Rosen said we should plan more thoroughly and consult more widely about what national issues are at play in an election campaign. And he said long before the campaign starts, we should talk with the community, engage with experts, undertake polling, think about national challenges, the immediate and the far-reaching. And then we should articulate that agenda. Let the political leaders know we'll be doing stories on these things, asking questions about them, seeking policy responses and political insights to them. And if the politicians won't engage, devote space to these issues anyway, using experts, finding divergent views, doing real investigations. And it wouldn't be the ABC's agenda. It would be an agenda framed by the audiences we engage with, by the voters who fund us from all around the nation. Perhaps it would be a way of countering tightly scripted politicians who only want policy discussions on the day and the terms they want, not what the public want. And some thinking like this might help us from reaching the end of a fascinating campaign with such important issues in play and saturation coverage, only to find out that somehow a significant number of people were left wanting more, feeling that their questions were left unasked, that there were issues still avoided, that there was too much noise and not enough light. But for all that, it was a remarkable campaign. And now I think we'd all agree a result would be nice. Thank you very much.